From a territory to a state, Nebraska is celebrating its 150th birthday this year, and K&EB Ag will be looking back throughout the year at the farmers, ranchers, technology, and more, which grew the panhandle of Nebraska to what it is today. The southern panhandle was traditionally rangeland, and in the 1800s it was predominantly large cattle companies, until it became overgrazed. Nebraska Extension dryland cropping specialist Cody Creech said the cattle companies moved out, leaving people to look for other sources of revenue, and they turned to crops. One of those crops was wheat.
1874 was when the Mennonites brought wheat to Kansas, and it was a turkey red wheat, and that essentially, that whole move essentially turned the this area, which was more or less considered a desert, it turned it into more of the breadbasket that it is today, with bringing that wheat over here that was drought resistant.
Families came to the southern panhandle by way of train, wagon, or autos. They put down roots, and many of those families are still in the area. The Perry family has farmed in the area since the early 1900s. John Perry and his son Justin still farm the land and grow wheat. John said his father Leonard Perry's family lost their homestead during the Depression, but he stayed in farming with his in-laws, John and Ann Shadig.
And that's why they moved out here. They started farming and, of course, got into wheat farming in that way, and then bought a section from the federal land bank, and that's the place that they called home for years. My dad was a mechanic at the John Deere until 1949, but had farming history for probably 25 years prior to that. A lot of farmers in the Kimball County area raised potatoes when they first started farming, as well as some wheat and other crops. But that's what started them farming, and then, like I say, in 1949, my dad moved out here.
Like John's family, many of the farmers were affected by the Depression. Creech said the Depression, on top of the drought, was hard on farmers. Constant plowing of the ground was hard on the soil and suffered wind erosion. It was Charlie Fenster, agronomist with the UNL College of Agriculture, who moved the grower to the next phase in wheat.
Of course, Charlie Fenster was a big proponent of managing our crop residue to protect the soil, and so we started move into that next phase of wheat growing, which was the kind of the conservation tillage, if you will, approach, where we conserve that a residue, and we manage that residue to conserve the soil moisture. And the wheat residue played a critical role in that because it's a very good residue.
After Fenster, Creech said the next big phase was the change in the actual wheat, brought about by Dr. Norman Borlaug, who did research in Mexico for drought-resistant wheat. Creech said the research really improved the wheat for growers.
It was a shorter wheat, which helped it to, the tall wheat, it took a long time to grow. So the shorter wheat, it could start to produce grain a lot sooner. It wouldn't lodge as much. It was easier to harvest with the machine. And so that was really critical for grain yield across the world. And so, of course, folks started to adopt those newer varieties of the semi-dwarfs.
Even with all the improvements, growing wheat, like most crops in the Panhandle, can be a risky business. John said it's the way of life that keeps him and his family growing the crop.
When my dad first moved out here to this farm, he was hailed out for the first 2 years in a row. A farmer is an eternal optimist, and there's always a better year coming, and we always look for that better year. So my dad continued to raise a few head of livestock as well as farm wheat, and between the combination of the two, it kept him going. There was times I heard my granddad, John Shadig, sometimes all they could do was afford a 25-pound bag of flour, and that was about all they had money for. So, there were some pretty rough times out here. What kept them going? What is just a way of life, I would assume. I know that's what's kept me going.
The Perrys still own the family homestead and grow wheat along with some other crops and pasture. Next week, we'll take a closer look at how wheat has progressed in Nebraska and where it's going as we continue our journey on 150 years. I'm Chabela Guzman, and 150 Years of Nebraska Agriculture is sponsored by Kelly Bean, proud to be a tri-state region tradition for 90 years.